Do you often get confused when to use must, have to, be supposed to, should, ought to, have got to in English? Well, you're not alone. These terms, known as modal verbs, are frequently used in everyday English conversations. They help express necessity, obligation, or advice, and are an essential part of mastering the English language. However, for many learners, these modal verbs can be a bit of a puzzle. They can seem interchangeable at times, yet subtly different in other contexts. It's no wonder why they can cause a fair bit of confusion. But don't worry, we're here to help. Over the next few moments, we'll delve into each of these modal verbs, breaking down their meanings, uses, and the nuances that differentiate them. Our aim is to help you navigate these tricky waters with confidence and ease. So buckle up as we try to make sense of these often puzzling English modal verbs. Let's start with must. This small word carries a lot of weight in the English language. Must is generally used to express something that is necessary or extremely important. It's like a command or an obligation that cannot be ignored. For instance, you must finish your homework before watching TV. Here, must is used to emphasize the importance of completing homework first. Another example could be, we must protect the environment. In this case, must shows the necessity to protect the environment. It's not a mere suggestion, it's a pressing requirement. However, must is not always about obligations and necessities. Sometimes it's used to express certainty. For example, she must be at home by now. Here, must indicates a strong belief or assumption about a situation. In a nutshell, must is a versatile word, helping us express obligations, necessities, and certainties. Remember, use must when there's a strong obligation or necessity. Next up, we have have to, be supposed to, should. These three phrases have unique purposes and usages, and understanding them can make a world of difference in your English language journey. Let's start with have to. This phrase is used when there's an obligation or necessity. It's a way to express that something is not optional. For instance, consider the sentence, I have to wake up early tomorrow. Here, have to is used to denote the obligation of waking up early. Moving on, let's decode be supposed to. This phrase is used when there's an expectation or a planned action that might not have happened. It's like a softer version of must. For example, let's look at the sentence, you are supposed to be here by now. This indicates that there was an expectation that is not being met. Finally, we have should. This is used when giving advice or recommendations. It's a polite way to express an opinion or suggestion. For example, you should try this new book. It's fantastic. Here, should is used to recommend a new book. The beauty of these phrases is that they can be used in various tenses. For instance, I had to leave early yesterday is have to in the past tense. Similarly, you were supposed to call me back is be supposed to in the past tense. And should can be used in the future tense, like you should visit Japan next year. Remember, these phrases are not interchangeable. Have to conveys a stronger sense of obligation than should, and be supposed to is more about unfulfilled expectations than obligations or advice. So have to for obligations, be supposed to for expectations, and should for advice. Simple enough, right? Finally, we have ought to and have got to. Let's dive in and unwrap these two fascinating expressions. Ought to and should are often considered interchangeable, both used in giving advice or making recommendations. However, there's a subtle nuance between them. Ought to has a slightly less forceful tone than should, making it the go-to option when you want to sound more polite or diplomatic. For instance, you ought to read this book. It's really insightful. Now, let's switch gears and talk about have got to. This phrase is a more informal and emphatic way of saying must or have to. It's typically used in conversational English to express urgent obligations or necessities. For example, I have got to finish this report by tomorrow. The urgency is palpable, isn't it? But remember, while ought to and have got to are commonly used, they may not always be the best choice. The context is key. If you want to sound formal or write in an academic or professional setting, must, should, or have to might be more suitable. On the other hand, if you're in a casual conversation or want to emphasize the urgency of the situation, have got to could be your perfect fit. And when you want to softly suggest something or hint at a better course of action, ought to can come in handy. In the end, Mastering these phrases is all about practice. Try using them in your daily conversations, write them in your English compositions, and soon they'll become second nature to you. So ought to for advice and have got to for urgent necessities. That wraps up our list. But remember, language is a living, evolving entity. Keep exploring, keep learning, and most importantly, keep communicating, because that's what language is all about, isn't it? All right, it's time for a quick recap. We've journeyed through the wonderful world of English modal verbs today, starting with must, an emphatic word used to express necessity or strong obligation. We then unraveled the mysteries of have to, be supposed to, and should, each carrying its own unique shades of meaning and context. Have to denotes a requirement, be supposed to implies expectation, while should advises or recommends an action. We also delved into ought to and have got to, both used to express obligation, but with ought to being more formal and have got to more colloquial. It's like a fascinating puzzle, isn't it? Each piece, each modal verb, fitting perfectly into the grand tapestry of the English language. Remember, practice makes perfect, so keep using these modal verbs in your everyday English. You've got this.